police are supposed to be arresting only in the clearest cut of cases. Okay, Andrew's going to be moving on to that, so I'll just leave that up there. In relation to CBD, without stepping onto Andrew's toes, we have met with SAPRA, which is the new MCC, and the Pharmacy Council. And they have confirmed to us what our reading of the law was prior to our meeting, which is that nothing in the way of medicinal or industrial cannabis has changed since the judgment. So all of those laws and those regulations and those license applications that I hinted at earlier that existed prior to the judgment, those are still the processes today that you need to follow if it is that you want to establish yourself a cannabis industry. In relation to CBD specifically, there seems to be a lot of misunderstanding in CBD. I think most of you will have seen that in the pharmacies you can buy CBD oil over the counter. It's sold under various guises, a health supplement, a nutritional supplement. You even see these pop-up stores, you know, with big cannabis leaves, and they're selling the CBD vape oil. And when I questioned one of these pop-up stores as to how they are doing this, the salesperson, who was just a salesperson in fairness and had been told what she had been told, says to me, well, no, CBD has never been unlawful or illegal, and you've always been allowed to use it and possess it. So, you know, what I sort of thought to myself was, okay, Fluffy, you enjoy that, and you get on with that, because if that's what you think, then I'm not quite sure I can help you, but tell your boss to phone me. Because you can actually get into a lot of trouble, and the long and the short of it is that if you are selling CBD without the right licenses and without the right authorizations, you are dealing in a prohibited substance, or in a scheduled substance. So that hasn't changed, and as much as we want it to have changed, it hasn't. And as much as people are getting away with it, it seems to be that they're getting away with it not because it's lawful, but because SAPRA and the Pharmacy Council are, like many South African departments and institutions, they're under-resourced, and they're fighting battles on many fronts, and they just haven't gotten around to it. So if you are in that industry, I say just be careful, because there will come a point where they do decide to make an example of somebody. It may not be you, it may be you, but be careful. And we then move on to hemp. Well, there's been no change in that either. That slide that I showed you earlier, it's still the same thing. Although we have hemp seeds that are readily available, and there's a lot of people who want to grow hemp, there just is no industry. But what has changed is that it does say that you can grow cannabis for personal use and consumption in a private space. Now, cannabis is hemp, although you've got different strains. So hypothetically, if you're on a small holding and you want to grow a whole lot of hemp in order to make cannabricks or to feed your cattle, technically you should be allowed to do that. The only thing is it's going to be very difficult when the arresting officer starts knocking at your door to say, well, all of this hemp is for me to make cannabricks or to knit socks or to feed my cattle. So some of the advice that we've been giving out is, if you are going to venture into that, do it in a manner that would allow you to pass an audit. So, you know, video yourself sowing the cannabis seeds, video the harvest and the fact that your cattle are eating it and that you are pressing it into cannabricks, and be able to show the house that you've built or the outbuilding that you've built out of cannabricks. So it's all just really that if one day you are charged, you are going to be able to convince the judge that this is in fact hemp grown for your own personal use. So that's the only slight nuance to what's changed in respect of hemp.
If you're looking to manufacture a product that has hemp seeds and distribute that like through a normal retail shop,
yes,
is that considered?
Unfortunately, here we still have Schedule 7 of the Medicines Act, and if you look at C, and does not contain whole cannabis seeds. Whole cannabis seeds. But you see, your problem, of course, is that you're going to have to grow cannabis because there is no legal distinction presently between hemp and cannabis. And if you're not growing it in order to produce the seeds, in order to sell them, are you growing that cannabis for your personal use or consumption?
So if you find out that the manure that the cattle produces is good compost and you sell that compost, is that then a derivative of?
It's actually one of the more creative questions I've been asked. If you'll excuse the pun, it's a bit of a bullshit question. But, no, I really, and I'm speaking from experience, I really doubt that you're going to find an arresting officer even with the impetus to now suggest that manure from hemp-fed cattle is somehow a product that is prohibited in terms of the Drugs Act. I mean, I think if the prosecutor were to make the decision, well, if the arresting officer were to make the decision to arrest, the prosecutor would mock them, and if the prosecutor didn't mock the arresting officer, the judge would mock the prosecutor. So I think that's the kind of layering that I think would be safe. You know, similarly, I've got it on good authority that hemp-fed cattle, actually, their milk contains CBD. So it's another grey area. I certainly know that you can't advertise the milk as containing CBD. That's something that Andrew might be able to touch on. He's been doing some research on the advertising of cannabis and cannabis products. But to say that the cattle were fed with hemp, I don't think that's too bad. But of course, then you are commercializing it, which is, you know, it's such a grey area. You always have to fall back onto what the judgment intended, and keep in mind that everything that's in place presently is only supposed to be in place for the next 2 years. Hopefully, Parliament will wake up, and in 2 years' time, we're going to have a legal landscape that looks entirely different to how it looks today. So it's very difficult to say how that will look, and we're certainly going to be making submissions, etc., as to how that should look. But presently, you know, don't tempt fate. I know 2 years seems like a long way to wait, but you know, we've been at this for a number of years. The Dagga couple have been at this for even longer. Gareth Prince has been at this since 1998, so it's all relative as to how long we have to wait. So that's the effect on industry. A lot of people ask us about things like social clubs. You know, is it okay that we have a club and we charge for membership, etc., etc., and we sell pizza? The real thing that you don't want is cannabis changing hands for money. And it doesn't matter how many layers or how many loopholes you think that you found. I always say again, think like the prosecutor and like the judge. You can say to the prosecutor, oh no, we're charging for membership and then we're giving them free cannabis. They're going to say, no, you're selling them cannabis. We've got a term in our law called in freudem legis, which means you're defrauding the law, or you're looking too hard for a loophole. And it's something that prosecutors and judges have been trained to look for, and they're not stupid people. So you know, you might get away with it. It might be because you don't have a grumpy prosecutor, but at the end of the day, it's all going to be a test case if it could be suggested that cannabis is changing hands for money. So I'm sure a lot of you are going to have some hypothetical questions after this talk. Would this work? Would that work? The answer is probably going to be the same. It may not. It depends on whether you're willing to be the test case. There are certain industries, of course, that objectively are fine. I mean, if you're growing cannabis at home, just like you could grow tomatoes at home or pretty flowers at home, there doesn't seem to be any problem if you get a professional gardening service to come in who tends to your cannabis, so long as they don't take any of your cannabis or give you any cannabis. They're providing a service. They're providing a gardening service. That ought objectively to be fine, and you could even hold yourself out as being a cannabis expert if in fact you were that. Paraphernalia, etc. I mean, this is the sky's the limit. I mean, traditionally we've had shops selling bongs for a number of years. That always has been legal, but now that people are growing at home, people are are going to want lights. They're going to want, grow tunnels and hydroponics kits and possibly even extraction kits, etc., etc. So if you are able to provide those sorts of products or services, the sky's the limit. You can start making money off cannabis legalization tomorrow, or the fact that people are allowed to grow at home. Finally, to conclude my section of this, well, what can we expect sort of 2 years' time from now and beyond? Well, what the judgment was very explicit about, and this is just how the law works, is that the Constitutional Court, you've all heard of the separation of powers, and it often gets fought about politically quite a lot. The legislature or the executive gets told that what they're doing is unconstitutional, and the Constitutional Court gives them a slap on the wrist, and they say, oh no, you're overstepping the separation of powers. And I think that the Constitutional Court has been reasonably conservative in this. You'll find it throughout the judgment. They say, well, we're not going to tell Parliament what to do. We're not going to tell the cops how much is too much cannabis. But what they did do through allowing personal use and possession at home is they've set a minimum threshold of freedoms. We can never go backwards. It can't be that in 2 years' time, Parliament all of a sudden creates a law that says that you can't grow, use, and possess at home. So what we then hope for is that they're going to legislate to allow for more liberties. And there are things that we are going to do as Schindlers and as the Dagga couple, and there are things that you can do. Now, one of the questions that's been posed to us, and more so to the Dagga couple, is, well, what happens to your Western Cape High Court case? We seem to have settled on a strategy, and I've been told that I'm allowed to tell you, which is that we are going, sorry, did I say Western Cape? Yes. Pretoria case, is that we don't want to withdraw it because we don't know what Parliament's going to do. At the same time, we can't really push it too hard because we don't know what Parliament's going to do. So the plan at the moment is to approach the Deputy Judge President for a new date for the remainder of the trial, for the hearing of the remainder of the trial, but that date is post the 2 years after the Constitutional Court judgment that Parliament has to fix the laws. So in a sense, it's the proverbial gun to the head, which is to say to Parliament, all right, you've got 2 years, but if you don't do this properly and actually liberalize and set a proper or legislate so that your laws aren't open to further constitutional challenge, well, then we are going to complete the trial. And we are going to have the judge tell you to do what you ought to have done all along. So it's a carrot and a stick scenario. But in the meantime, what's supposed to happen with Parliament is that they're supposed to draft legislation, and then there's a public participation. They release the draft to the public. And they're supposed to give sufficient opportunity that all and sundry can make submissions to them, written, verbal on application submissions, to say, well, no, you haven't accounted for that, or you ought to go further there, etc., etc. So while we intend to be taking part in that through the Dagga couple, you all as individuals and collectives should be doing the same thing to the extent that you have an interest. But what is very helpful is that Jules and Myrtle are already serving almost as a consolidated or an arrowhead front for a number of interests. So if it is that you don't have the personal impetus to go to Parliament or to write to them yourselves, when the time comes, make your case to Jules or Myrtle, and we can then consolidate everything and distill it and make a unified case to Parliament. One very, very important thing, and this is something that everybody seems to agree on, is that we require regulation, but there is a risk of over-regulation. If you make the license applications, etc., too onerous and too expensive, what are you going to do? You're going to open up the market for the multinationals or the already rich, and you're going to close the door on the small-scale farmers, those guys in the Eastern Cape and the former Transkei who are already earning a small subsistence wage off growing cannabis. You know, it's really it's the African mamas whose husbands, the heads of the households, they're running the household. The husbands have gone off. They're migrant labor. They're working in the cities, and you know, these women are very hardworking, and they sow the millie fields and they feed the families with millies. And then with that little bit of extra cannabis that they grow, they can sell that, and they can then afford the school uniforms and the education of their children, etc. If we squeeze those people out through overregulation, it would be a crying shame. So these are some of the submissions that, this is one of the things that I think we all really need to shout loudest about to Parliament, is whatever you do, leave those guys alone and make sure that we can actually use this as a way for people to bring themselves up out of poverty instead of just increasing the cycle of the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer. So that's it from me. I will answer some questions at the end, but over to Andrew, who's going to tell you what you can and cannot do in the legislative space as it stands. Thank you very much.
Right. Evening, everyone. So what I'm going to talk to you about now is a system that was put in place long before this judgment. It reflects a lot of what's wrong with the current cannabis industry, and you'll see that it's almost engineered to keep cannabis out of your hands unless it's in very, very dire circumstances. And yeah, you'll notice that a lot of interest sparked with the cannabis industry when the NCC released their guidelines. Not sure how many of you are familiar with those. The NCC came out with pretty detailed guidelines on what you would need in order to apply for a legal cannabis grow, cannabis farm. And this got everyone excited, very, very excited. I mean, within months they had received something like 1,000 applications, none of which have been granted yet. What no one was thinking about, though, is what can I do with my tons of cannabis once I've grown it? And the answer you'll find is actually very little. You would be left with tons of cannabis, which ultimately you'd have to destroy. So what those guidelines were gearing you up to, they were gearing you up to apply for a specific license in terms of the Medicine Act. This license is called the Section 22C1B license, and it's here over there. You can read the whole thing or just trust what I'm about to tell you. What it allows you to do, once obtained, is import, export, and cultivate marijuana. Now, export is simple enough. Once you've got your license, you can export it. That's fine. That is the most obvious and probably the most profitable industry which has been opened, well, it's been around for a long time now, but that's probably the easiest route to making money you have right now. It's also not ideal because we want to keep the cannabis in South Africa. So we're setting ourselves up essentially to be like Lesotho, where everyone grows their cannabis and can't actually use it unless you're giving it to the Canadians or the people from the Netherlands. So in order to export or cultivate or import, you need that Section 22C license. In order to possess cannabis or handle cannabis in any way, you need a permit from the Department of Health. So now you've already got 2 licenses, all right, that you need in order just to have cannabis, just to grow it out of the ground in the first place. So this is Section 22A of the Medicines Act. Also, this is the machinery by which you obtain a permit from the Director General. So at any point at which you're going to handle cannabis, you need one of these. It doesn't really matter who you are. You can be a pharmacist, a doctor, a farmer of cannabis with the Section 22C license. You can't avoid having to get one of these as well. So already you can see how it's quite onerous. I mean, you want to embark on this journey of growing and supplying cannabis, but now you already need 2 lengthy licenses. Now bear in mind that Section 22C license, none have been granted yet, and the first applications went in over a year ago. So bear in mind now what Paul Michael touched on is that we are expecting changes from Parliament. They've been mandated to change certain aspects of our law. That's not to say they have to stop there. They can definitely continue, and as Paul Michael says, we'll be doing our best to make sure they go beyond that and actually give us the machinery we need for a legitimate industry. So The magic of cannabis, as we all know, is in its APIs. It's in its active pharmaceutical ingredients. It's the CBD, the THC. All right, now different considerations apply to these things. CBD, as Paul Michael said, is a Schedule 4 substance. There's less tape around that, but I'll start with cannabis and the red tape that being Schedule 7 invites. So cannabis is defined as cannabis, the whole plant, or any portion thereof. That means seeds, and that means hemp. Our law considers that to be cannabis. So as soon as you're talking about seeds, as soon as you're talking about hemp, you need both of these permits that I've just gone through, the Section 22C as well as the Section 22A. The seeds and the hemp are Schedule 7 for all intents and purposes. So when we're talking about things like CBD and THC, we're talking about APIs, as Paul Michael touched on, active pharmaceutical ingredients. Now, these can't just be sold to anyone. In fact, they can only be sold to manufacturing pharmacies. All right? You can't sell concentrated CBD or concentrated THC to the public. Those need to be sold to manufacturing pharmacies, who in turn will use those ingredients to create medicines. Medicines are what can be sold to the public. So as I'm talking, you might notice there's an increasing gap here between the end user and the grower of cannabis. Now, there is no machinery currently which allows you to obtain a license, grow cannabis, and sell it to the public. There's quite a vast interconnecting web of licenses and institutions that come between the grower and the end user. So I've already talked about the permit as well as the Section 22C license. Now, that gets the cannabis out the ground. What do you do with it then? So if you don't export it, you'll sell it to a manufacturing pharmacy. The manufacturing pharmacy will then distill that down to whatever they need, whatever CBD or THC concentrates they need in order to synthesize other medicines. Those medicines, once synthesized, have to be registered before they can be sold to the public. The registration process takes up to 5 years. SAPRA has told us that. 5 years. So now, that's to register a medicine which contains APIs. Now, if you think about a cannabis plant, what does that do? It contains APIs. Cannabis right now is thought of as a medicine. So if you're talking about registering medicine and that takes 5 years, we're talking about registering each strain of cannabis, which will take 5 years. Now, we all know how many strains of cannabis out there. We don't know the total, but we have an idea. It's lots. So the current regime doesn't leave really any room for the sale, the growth out the ground, and then the sale of cannabis to the public. You now have to register these things as a medicine. On top of that, the grower can't even apply to have it registered. The grower has to turn it over to a manufacturing pharmacy, who then has to synthesize a medicine and register that particular medicine. On top of that now, the manufacturing pharmacy has to sell that medicine to a wholesale pharmacy. The wholesale pharmacy can then sell it to a community pharmacy, which is like your Discam or Clicks. Then they can sell it to the public, provided that person has a prescription. So there's 3 pharmacies you have to go through before this medicine is grown out the ground, registered, and ready for public use. So there's arguments to be made about why that's the case. I mean, if you're talking about a medicine here, you need something consistent. You need to know what your patients are using. It has to be quality. The quality has to be controlled quite tightly. When you're talking about medicinal, everything has to be better. Controls have to be tighter, because you don't want to be the doctor that prescribes the wrong thing to the patient. And on top of that, you don't want to be the pharmacist who supplied it or labeled it incorrectly. So it's tight for good reason, I'd say, but it can afford to loosen up on this particular medicine here. I mean, no one's ever died from cannabis, and I don't think, aside from someone maybe being a bit paranoid, they're not actually going to, it's not going to be fatal, giving them the wrong thing, which is why there is room to loosen the grip somewhat. So now, when we're talking about supplying CBD, it's a Schedule 4 substance. So the first barrier that gets removed when you're talking about a Schedule 4 as opposed to a Schedule 7 substance is that you don't need this 22A permit. All right. In fact, with CBD, once again, it still has to go through that whole shebang of being included in a medicine before it can be sold to the public. You can't just sell raw CBD or CBD concentrate to the public. It has to be included in a medicine. So really the only barrier that's removed is this Section 22A permit. So once a CBD containing medicine has gone through the process of registration, it's taken its 5 years, and it ends up on the shelf in a pharmacy, the person who's buying it needs a script. You need a prescription. So despite what you may see out there now, it's very illegal for someone to sell you a Schedule 4 substance, a Schedule 4 medicine, if you don't have a script for that. Once again, why this is necessary, we don't know, and we hope it'll change. The CBD, largely, once again, it won't kill you. It will help you sleep better, sure, improve your skin, but I don't think it'll kill you. I don't think it warrants the same kind of registration, warrants the same kind of protection as something like Miprodol. And just for interest's sake, Schedule 7 is the same schedule as methamphetamine, which is currently how our law views cannabis for industrial purposes, which is crazy. So the Section 21 application, which Paul Michael touched on, that is currently the only way which an end user can obtain CBD. I'll touch on cannabis and why it's not possible through that mechanism for now. But since we have no registered medicines in South Africa which contain CBD, and we won't for at least 5 years if the laws don't change, since that's the case, the only way you can actually obtain it is by way of a Section 21 application. So what this allows you to do, it allows your doctor to apply on your behalf to SAPRA to obtain an unregistered medicine, because it's the only thing that will work for you. You've tried everything else. This is what the doctor now has to put forward to SAPRA, and the only thing that will work for you is an unregistered medicine. But that's not to say they can just import any unregistered medicine from anywhere. The particular medicine has to be registered in a recognized jurisdiction. So the list of recognized jurisdictions actually hasn't been shared with us yet, but I'd say somewhere like Canada would be recognized. Places like the Netherlands, you can't just go to any random country and find a medicine you like and then tell a doctor to get it for you. The doctor has to make a case, they have to lay out a dosage regime and justify why it is you need that particular medicine that's registered elsewhere. So this hasn't worked for cannabis yet. By the way, for CBD containing medicines, there have been about 30 successful cases. And the Section 21 application process doesn't actually take that long. It takes about 5 days. So if you really are suffering and you need CBD, there's nothing stopping you from approaching a doctor and obtaining it like this. But unfortunately, you're not going to be able to walk into a pharmacy and just sort yourself out there yet, because if you can, the pharmacy is breaking the law in the first place, and you probably are by not having a script. No doctor can actually write you a script for a medicine that isn't registered here. They have to go through this. Yeah, exactly. So the reason why it's more difficult with cannabis now is because that particular doctor also has to have this, going back, Section 22A permit. We haven't heard of anyone who's even registered for one of these. No one really knows that you need them. So I can't tell you how long it'll take, but if it's anything like the 22C license, you're looking at least a year. So this poor doctor now, who just wants to help a patient, now needs one of these, as well as a section.
CBD.
Yeah?
Even for CBD.
Even for CBD, no, because CBD is not a Schedule 7 substance. For CBD, the Section 21 by itself is sufficient. That's all a doctor needs, and then he can actually import it, which invariably ends up happening through a pharmacist. The doctor will approach a pharmacist, the pharmacist will identify the correct medicine, and then they'll import it with the Section 21 application having been done on their behalf. Excuse me, just finding myself. So, yeah, that's really all there is to it. I mean, nothing's changed. As I say, this whole thing is just designed to put red tape and keep cannabis out of the hands of the general public, except in very, very rare cases. I mean, with your Section 22C license, which everyone got all excited about, thinking now we can grow cannabis, we can supply it to whoever we like, when in fact all you can do is export it or give it to a pharmacist, a manufacturing pharmacist. So now why on earth would a manufacturing pharmacist want to buy tons of cannabis when there's no registered medicine that they can use it in? They can't integrate it into anything. So you can see how your supply is cut short in cannabis. There is really nowhere to move the cannabis you grow in South Africa. I mean, no one can use it for anything really. CBD is the same, because in order to locally produce CBD, we need a Section 22C license to grow cannabis, extract the CBD. Well, a pharmacist will have to extract the CBD, but once again it falls flat because there's no CBD registered medicine, and there won't be for 5 years if things carry on the way they are. So as far as grower to end user, there is simply nothing yet. If you want CBD, you can grab it, you can get it for a doctor to apply on your behalf, and they can bring in a registered CBD product for you. With regard to cannabis, we don't know of any successful applications for it yet. And even if a doctor were to embark on that process, they're now faced with having to get this Section 22A permit, which takes more time and makes it more difficult for them to get cannabis. And invariably what happens is, if you're in pain, you'll get a painkiller. If you need your appetite back, there are other drugs that are catered to that specific purpose. It's very hard to make out a case on why you want cannabis in particular, other than you want to get high, but that doesn't really fly when you're applying for licenses like that, unfortunately. So as far as the industry goes, those are the limitations in place, clearly designed to make it difficult for everyone. And the reason we think that they're not going to be around for too much longer, A, we know that Parliament has now been mandated to get off their ass and make something happen. B, what the Constitutional Court judgment has done is they've acknowledged that this is not particularly harmful. This is not something that needs or warrants such protection. If we, all as private adults, can now grow it and use it in the privacy of our own home, I mean, I don't see any similar ideas floating around about meth. That's in the same schedule as cannabis and for all intents and purposes treated the same as cannabis. So we've got this public policy now, which is informed by the Constitution and what the Constitutional Court says, saying that we accept as a country that cannabis is okay for us to grow and use personally. But as soon as you want to make an industry about it, you need all this red tape and all these licenses, and something like that simply can't stand now. I mean, we can't wait 5 years for every single strain of cannabis we want to be registered, when the court has said you can grow whatever strain you want right now, today. So there's a logical inconsistency there that will have to be mowed out if this judgment is to really mean anything for the cannabis industry in South Africa. So yeah, that's the reason why we believe they're going to change, and why we're going to try our best to move that process along. I think as a community, from all reaches of life when it comes to cannabis, from us, the lawyers, to the users, to the patients, to the doctors, we all have a role to play. And these next 2 years are the time we do it. We have the means in place. We have the Dagga couple spearheading the whole thing, what could go wrong. So yeah, the best thing to do is get involved, keep educating yourself, come to things like this, go to other ones. Please go out there, and if you can remember the things we told you, tell other people. We get many phone calls, many emails about, in particular, the club thing. Can we charge a monthly fee and give free cannabis? Can we charge people 1,000 Rand for a shirt, and then a week later they get delivered a banky? You can't do that. It's a no-no. So, yeah. Well, yeah, so, yeah, I haven't been completely honest with you about the registration there. So 5 years, sure. And the reason that takes so long is because you need clinical data. You need studies, you need evidence, you need quite a volume of stuff in order to register this medicine. But there is a reliance basis, and that can save significant time. How much time, I'm not sure. But what it means is that you can rely on clinical data from other countries, such as Canada, to prove that this medicine does what you say it does, or is capable of doing what you say it is capable of doing. So there is a reliance basis, and we can use clinical data and research from other countries to move the process along somewhat.
But that's in relation to a specific medicine that has been registered overseas?
Yes, once again, that's not in relation to cannabis as a whole. That's in relation to a cannabis-containing medicine, or a particular strain of cannabis. So there's really quite a legislative chokehold on the whole cannabis industry right now. But I think over time and in the next 2 years, it'll gradually loosen for the better. It just has to. We can't have the Constitutional Court saying that it's fine for all of us to use and grow it, but then the regulatory regime behind it saying, no, this warrants the same protection and consideration as meth. I mean, yeah.
Just off the back of that, Andrew, are our authorities not also looking at reducing the schedules on certain concentrations of CBD and those sorts of things?
Yes, yeah, that's quite correct. In the medicine, in the meeting we had with SAPRA and the Pharmacy Council, they were discussing, or they said discussions were going to commence about certain concentrations of CBD in particular. And what they're talking about there is whether very low concentrations can be allowed to be Schedule 0, essentially, for the purposes of beauty products, your skin care, and such things. But as soon as it's medicinal, I mean, the conversations haven't even begun yet about lowering the schedule for that. But in as much as you can limit the concentration of CBD to things like beauty products, to things where they don't really have an inward medicinal effect, we're not sure what they're talking about or if they're talking about that yet. But certainly there are conversations happening about CBD-related beauty products, which that news might find some of you well. Yes?
So obviously us being at point A,
Aye.
wanting to move towards point B,
Yeah.
you mentioned countries like Lesotho earlier and stuff like that.
Yeah.
I don't want to compare apples and oranges, but how does their law differ to ours? And how do we get there? That's just
Yes.
this question. But what's the fundamental difference to a non-legal person?
So I'm not too clued up on Lesotho's laws, but I can tell you what happens in Lesotho is, once again, it's actually very difficult for an end user to get cannabis, and in fact, you can only get it medicinally. And there's also red tape that you have to cross in order to get that. So there's no recreational trade in Lesotho. It's a similar situation whereby Canada, for example, it's a cold place. Their cannabis is all grown indoors. They've identified an opportunity there with cheap labor and good climate. And the government's allowed that to happen and allowed the investment to come in.
It's really just a tax.
It's really just bringing foreign direct investments in, yeah.
The other thing, I mean, just having spoken to, you know,
Should we open this up to questions?
Yeah, I think-
Yeah.
I think that's the end of the presentation, so
Yes.
want to come up.
Yeah.
So just further to that, I mean, the other thing that one realizes, you know, there's nothing in any of these regulations related to our local licenses that talks about
6 or 8 licenses or whatever it is are going to be given out. Not having studied the laws, but having spoken to people who have participated in those processes, it does very much seem that in a lot of those countries, there's been an economic case that's been made. You know, as Andrew says, they've realized that somebody from Canada has approached them and told them that they're willing to pay, you know, top dollar for this kind of thing, and then they sort of make like an exception, an exclusion zone, and then they say, right, well, we're going to be issuing 8 licenses to very large-scale farms, and in order to get one of these licenses, you need to put down $6 million US, even just for us to consider the license application. So I think we're a little bit more formal than that, but at the same time, I would say probably a little bit more legitimate. You know, the actual license application here, although it might be very expensive to get your site master file in order, it's not that expensive. I mean, we're talking about in the region of 20,000 Rand, you know, from start to finish.
Well, the expensive part there is actually getting your whole operation up to a point where you can register it. I mean, they're going to send an inspector to go through the whole operation with you. Your whole operation will be contained in a site master file. It's essentially your Bible, your constitution of your whole operation. So that Section 22C license, as I said, allows you to export, import, as well as cultivate. Now, it doesn't automatically give you the right to do all 3. When you're applying for that, you'll create a site master file, and if you want to import, that site master file will contain every single detail of your import operation, from who you're buying it from, who's getting it across the border, who's it given to after that. If you want to export, same thing, it's included in the site master file. If you want to cultivate, site master file. So you really have to have all of that down to a T before you apply, and they're going to send an inspector to go through that with you. So that's the expensive part, is getting your operation up to a standard where the inspector goes through it with you and everything can be ticked off. You can't just say, I've got the best security ever, I've got the best distribution chains ever, meanwhile there's just nothing. So that's the expensive part. The actual application itself isn't really too expensive at all.
So with the site master file, you're saying that you can't apply for all 3, well, you wouldn't be able to apply for all 3 faculties, growing, processing, distributing.
You can.
You
just
can.
have- all has to be contained in that document.
So within the site master file, you would have to have your GAP, which is your agricultural practices, your GMP in order,
Yeah.
and then your GCP, I'd say.
What's the GCP?
Clinical practices.
Clinical
Because if you're going to make something that's going to go for medical purposes, it has to be.
So that would be more in the region of the pharmacists, the clinical practice. So when you're talking about growing cannabis out the ground, the actual plant, by
Well,
the
yeah,
time
that's
that's
the way-
processed,
yeah,
that's
yeah.
going to be handed over to a pharmacist. That's a separate license. You can't, as a farmer, produce your own APIs.
So there we go. So you can't have all three, but growing, processing, and industry.
Well, I mean, you can partner with a pharmacist or a pharmacist company who then is on site and is doing the extraction and processing for you so that you can then...
So as long as your site master file has got everything, all
Well,
the
your site
GMP,
master file
GMP.
would, excuse me, your site master file would identify the pharmacist who you've
Yes,
partnered with.
of course. And then
You know.
make your site up to spec with, like you're saying, the size of the door, whether or
Yeah.
not there's eaves over the wall,
Yeah.
etc., etc.
Yeah, it's very detailed. Yeah.
Has there been any mention or discussion regarding, like, for example, syntax on alcohol or tobacco?
I don't think we're there yet. I mean, I think it's a fair assumption that if we do get to a regulated framework, that it would be in place. But the simple answer is that we're not there yet. We'll have to. There's a whole process that needs to happen before the legislation and regulations get put into force. It has to go to public comment, and we'll see where that comes. It's a bit of an unknown at the moment, but I think it's a fair assumption that if we moved into a regulated industry where it was publicly available, it would be subject to some sort of syntax, even if it fell under a different name.
Go so far as to say that's the only reason it'll ever be regulated, is because you can tax it to it.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, the potential to increase the tax base is quite significant with an industry like this. It's something that's been outlawed for as long as it has. So I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing either.
Do you reckon you could circumvent all of this medical thing by just growing weed that has no medical value? Because that's what they tell you for the last 70 years. You can say, I'm not growing medicine, I'm growing weed.
No, the point is you can grow your own medicine. There's nothing stopping you.
But
So
you-
long as it's for personal consumption. The problem is when you're
Yeah.
now trying
No,
to...
okay.
The issue comes with the commercialisation and trying to make an industry out of it and trying to make a profit off of it.
In the workspace, if I carry CBD on me that I use myself, is it my private space? Will I be allowed to?
I think so long as you are keeping it private. I mean, if you start taking the drops in front of people, you know, workspaces are private. But you know, if you carry the street feed to work and you produce it yourself, there ought not to be any problem with that.
Wouldn't I be seen under the influence?
No, but CBD is not CBD. I mean, but the point is, it's an interesting aspect that you raise because there are a lot of labour law consequences that are now flowing from this. You know, I don't know if you heard recently there were those, I think, 300 odd truck drivers who were dismissed for being under the influence of cannabis, and of course it's impossible to tell when they smoked, whether they did it over the weekend or whether they did it on the morning of. But there was just this presumption, and I know that the employer argued that because they're driving heavy machinery and there is the potential to hurt people in the process, they have to have this zero tolerance policy. I'm sure that's going to go through various appeals, etc. We don't have the final answer on that. But CBD, I think you could make a very compelling case for an unfair dismissal if you were, or even just unfair labour practice if you were disciplined for taking that in the workplace.
It's the kind of thing that you could do for pre-approval as well.
Yeah.
I mean, if it doesn't have any psychoactive components and it isn't going to have sort of any inhibition on your mental abilities, it seems like this type of thing that you could get pre-approval
Also-
from at your place of work.
Also, those
Be the
standard
safest route.
those standard drug tests don't test for CBD; they test for THC.
Yeah. Also,
No, sure.
if you obtain CBD under Section 21, that's fine. It's a registered medicine that's been brought in legally, and you have a
No,
prescription
I'm
for it.
talking
That's
about
different.
CBD that I'd sell, make myself for myself.
Yeah, once everything that Carl and Paul Michael just said applies then.
Sorry, on a smaller scale, what I'm understanding here now is legally I can't actually buy seeds from anybody, but I want to grow it home for myself, type of thing. But what I'm still also not understanding is the guys walk into my house and my whole land is turned into a wheat point or whatever.
Yeah.
I mean, where do we draw the limit? You know, type of thing. I'm just sort of asking the question there, you know, am I safe to grow 10 plants, or 20 plants, or 50 plants?
You know, it's so difficult. I I've read through this judgment now a number of times, and I notice something new every time I read it. But the problem is that often what I notice is contradicted by something a few paragraphs back or a few paragraphs forward. So I really think what happened here is that the judges realized that something needed to change, and they've left it largely in the hands of the legislature. But then there was this question, well, what in the next two years? And as much as they thought through it, you know, they didn't cover every eventuality. You know, there are certain absurdities. You know, if you're not allowed to buy the seeds, well then you've either donated, one of your friends has donated them to you, or somebody you know has donated them to you. But that then means that the cannabis that they grew wasn't only for personal use, because part of the cannabis was to be donated to you. The other thing is that, well, where did they get the cannabis? So did they need to possess the cannabis prior to the judgment? Which means that somewhere along the line, somewhere along the supply chain, a crime needs to have been committed. And that could never have been the intention of the legislature. So I don't know if that answers your question, but...
The one thing, look, I understand that part. The one thing is, I want to know if the police rock up in my house and I've got 5 tents inside my house and I've got 5 different strands growing.
Yeah.
I can just tell the guy, well, this is for me, I'm trying all the different strands.
Yes.
And perfectly legal to do that.
And technically they ought not to arrest you because there isn't an upper limit yet on it. Nobody said that 5 plants is too much or 10 plants is too much. It's all objective. You know, I use that analogy, and again, surviving an audit. I mean, film yourself 10 nights in a row, smoking yourself to a stupid just so that you can show what a heavy cannabis is.
We've just got one now.
I just want to ask you guys, can you grow for someone else's personal use?
No, that's a great
Because like,
area.
what if it's like you say you're an expert, somebody's an expert at making beautiful cannabis, like, and they can't grow it themselves. Yeah, they can't grow it themselves for, I don't know, space, they don't have, can you grow
So what's the question that you're asking? Are you saying that there's one person
that can grow
with you need to help grow, or are you saying that you
no,
can't
they don't
make a
stay
profit
with
of doing
you.
this?
No, I'm saying, can you grow for other people? For their personal use?
Like a club, basically you allow 10 people, you register 10 people and grow for them.
The judgment says cultivation of cannabis for that person, for their own personal use. But then, prior to that, and this is where I talk about these contradictions in the judgment, it also says any act associated with the cultivation of cannabis for a person's private use. And you combine that with the fact that it says, well, you know, growing privately doesn't mean that you have to necessarily grow it at home. There are other private spaces outside of your home where you can grow it. So what does that mean? Does that mean that you must now rent a shipping container in town, or does it mean that you can grow at your friend's house? I would say that if we adopt the purpose of interpretation to the judgment, I think a prosecutor is going to find an uphill battle convincing a judge to prosecute your friend for drug dealing if they weren't making any money. If it's so that you live in a high-rise and you don't know, and you don't have green fingers, and you don't have the space, and you want your friend with a garden to grow for you, so what?
It's also why I say it comes back to the question. If you're talking about helping a friend or a situation like that, that's one thing. But if you're speaking about offering a service to the public, that you're trying to industrialize this and make a profit, or you say, look, I've got this space, anyone's welcome to come, pay me X, I'll grow you your cannabis and we can move forward, that's a very different question. And
answer that question, because it's still not, you're still not pay, they're not buying, they're giving you you're growing it for them, you're not profiting off the cannabis.
Okay, so I can answer it with a question if I may. You growing the cannabis for them now?
Yes.
Are you growing it for your own personal consumption, your own personal use in private? So, if I can actually premise it with this, I'm not saying that's necessarily what my views are on the topic, or I don't think that's necessarily what's right, but if you look at the judgment, that's all we've got for right now. We have the judgment, we've got, you know, the legislature will be making moves in the future, and we have seen some draft prosecutorial guidelines that are making the rounds.
But hypothetically, I mean, how in this whole investigation or stumbling upon this process do they establish who this person is growing for? I mean, unless it is this big industrial growth.
That's what I say. You know, if you come to my plot and it's all there, that's going to be tough to justify as, you know. personal cultivation for use in private by me.
If you live in an apartment lot and there's a communal, say, pool area with a garden, and you grow in that section.
So it's actually something I've thought about because it's the situation that I live in. The difficulty, I mean, leave aside public versus private who has access to it, but do children have access to that communal pool area, and are they expected to be around there? What sort of safety controls are in place? So we don't have a strict definition on what is private space, but you need to take these sorts of things into account if you're living in communal areas where more people than just you and yours may be there.
That also applies to non-consenting adults.
Well, that's the point.
Yeah.
It's about the private space. Can we fly with weed in our bags?
Yeah.
We've been debating that.
We've tried.
I think give the dogs a few months to adjust their senses.
I think on a strict reading of the judgment, yes.
Yeah.
It's in your personal bag, checked in.
But that doesn't mean that those sniffer dogs aren't still there and that these people think that you're not allowed to. And I mean, the other thing you must bear in mind is what the fine print on the ticket says.
Of course, it's up to the company.
Might be that you're contravening the actual airline's.
I think you must also remember what Paul Michael said during his portion of the talk earlier. It's one thing to be arrested, it's a different thing to get a criminal conviction. So whether you'll be fine at the end of the day, in all likelihood, yes, but that may not prevent you from being arrested and going through that trauma. It's not a nice experience, as anyone who's gone through it will tell you. It's not gonna get you out of that.
Thank you. Firstly, I think on behalf of everyone, this is fantastic. So thank you very much. I'd just like to bring it back to, in terms of licenses and gray areas. We touched on gray areas earlier. And I know there's a few dispensaries that are operating already publicly as well as advertising, and under a traditional healer practice. So according to the Traditional Healers Practitioners Act, a traditional healer is allowed to prescribe cannabis. It falls under their indigenous plant system. So how does that come into play with like the MCC now? Because if it's easier to go that route and not apply for any licenses and then become a traditional healer, then you wouldn't have to pay $6 million and do this and do that and whatnot. You just register yourself as a healer. You can then grow it and cultivate it and prescribe it. So I just wanted to find, you know, is that a gray area? Is that a better angle to take? Or?
I don't think we have a clear answer for you. Do you maybe know what the criteria are to be a traditional healer? Does it require registration in and of itself? I mean, isn't there an association of traditional healers?
Yeah. So not personally, I don't know.
My point being that I really doubt that the pop-up store in Sandton City is run by a registered Sangoma.
Yes. Sure, but the guys in KZN are. I mean, they went all out. I've got nothing against them. It's just it's all about sharing knowledge.
There are certainly loopholes, and I'll always fall back on that concept of in Freudem legis. You're trying too hard, and it's going to. There's a lot of people who might get away with it for a long time until somebody doesn't, until somebody wakes up to the fact that this is not only a crime in terms of the Drugs Act, it's a crime in terms of the Medicines Act, the Pharmacy Act. You know, you're contravening multiple pieces of legislation, and then the hawks decide to raid your place, and then you're in the local KZN newspapers and.
Hard to get the business.
Sorry?
No, we probably have
what happens if Parliament doesn't make any rules in the next 2 years?
Then the present situation persists. It says that much. It says that much in the judgment.
Here's a question from the live stream. If somebody gives me their plant and I do an extraction of it, can I charge for the extraction as a service?
You know, it's an interesting one.
It is an interesting one.
We've come across this question before. Our opinion, and remember that our opinion is only worth the paper that it's written on when it comes to that arrest and prosecution. But you're not taking any cannabis from them and leaving with it. You're not giving them any cannabis that they didn't have before. So what are you doing? You're actually providing a service. You're not selling them cannabis. So I would say that that's probably all right.
Okay, well, I'm sure they're watching and listening.
If you own a venue or an event which people pay tax for entrance fee,
Yes.
and you just allow them to smoke, does that seem as your private space or is it a public space?
I think, you know, if it's one of those access only, you know, the person's fully alive to the fact that that this is a cannabis event and that cannabis. So you firstly need the consent because it needs to be around consenting adults. And if the only people who could access that event at that time, and remember this includes staff, the only people who could access that event were people who were so-called members or temporary members who were accessing that for purposes of partaking in cannabis smoking, probably fine. But from a labor law perspective, a workplace is not a private space for the very reason that, you know, it's not your private space. There's members of the public and there's cleaning staff, etc., etc.
So you would need consent from those
Well, you know, you also need to be careful about consent. You know, is it one of those things where you only get the job if? So it's
no, but if it's done fairly.
No, if
you got them to sign something.
If it's done fairly, look, I mean, this is really the point. Is that if you make it that they know exactly what they're getting themselves in for, and you've got a very strict policy at the door, and you make sure that nobody else can get in, and that there is no public access.
And is it a condition of the employment? What happens if one of the staff members says, "I'm actually not comfortable with that"?
Yeah.
You see, it'll be very difficult then to we all over the place.
Sorry, if I roll a joint now, and everyone here says, "Okay, let's do it," everyone, including you.
Well, we wouldn't tell anyone, but it wouldn't be allowed.
Remember
the live stream
it's very technical, but it comes from a place of labour law, that a place of employment is, yeah, and I mean, what did our invite say? Educating the public as to SA's cannabis laws. So you chaps all members of the public when you came in here today.
Sorry, Arna's had his hand up for a while.
I just actually want to ask back to the seeds. So hemp seeds are being sold for nutrition. I mean, you can buy them in discount.
Yes.
So just now you have this nice cheese, and you're selling these 3 seeds for nutrition. I mean, they're packed full of essential fatty acids. Would that be a little, you know, nice little snack?
But those seeds in the discount are terminated, yeah? They're not live seeds.
Well, so they say.
So they say, but we, you know, 1 in 3
and it comes back
yeah.
to the Latin term he's been throwing around. It's in Fraudum Legis.
Yeah.
It's probably not going to be okay, no.
Yeah.
No matter how many essential fatty acids are in there.
No, you know, that's the thing. I mean, do they have such high quality fatty acids that you can sell 3 for 1,000 rand?
No, but 900 is
Just as far as growing, I don't have a place to grow where I live, but could we have 10 guys together and having different strains? We can grow, this is 10 guys, our club, only for us, whatever comes out of it is for our purpose. Is that possible?
So we get this question a lot. If you're talking about commercializing something like that, if you want to be, for example, a body corporate that leases land out and then people grow on their portion of land, that's a bit more tricky and most probably illegal. But if you guys, as 10 mates, for example, come together on your land, plant your weed and take steps to ensure that my weed is separate from his weed. This is my personal stash, this is his personal stash, and you fence that off. Take steps to ensure that it's still yours, and that you're not profiting from it, then sure.
And that you're able to show that.
And that you're able to show that.
And that's what we spoke about the audit trail earlier. I mean, it's
as in video yourself planting your own weed.
And have like a clear contract between the 10 of you that this 4 square meters is mine and that 6 square meters is yours, and don't you come and take off my 4 square meters.
So if you're talking about solving a problem of no space to grow, then sure. But if you're talking about commercializing it and having hectares and inviting thousands of people to sign lease agreements and then sell, probably illegal. Can't say for sure.
What about throwing events like
cannabis
cups, part-time cannabis cups, for the breeders and personal growers?
What about them?
Thanks
very much.
Yeah, to host them.
Are you? Is there any cannabis changing hands?
Or money?
No, but for
Testing.
the judges, yes. For the judges.
Yeah, look,
There's no
it's great because I mean it seems reasonably clear from the judgment that it didn't say that the person needs to be alone. So obviously the judges are contemplating the fact that people are going to get together and share cannabis. You know, and that's really what's happening there, is they're getting together and sharing cannabis. But as soon as you know, you also need to be careful what happens there. You know, it's a place that's ripe for, you know, under the counter drug deals and that sort of thing. And you don't want some undercover person exposing that, and then you as the organizer of the event go down for allowing that sort of thing.
So what I would think there is, if you were going to do something like that, the cannabis would have to be weighed. It would have to be kept separate from everything, and then brought out by you as your own cannabis for a testing sample. Just brainstorming. If there were steps to taken to ensure that the only cannabis on that premises was that outlet and then being judged, I would have a tough day in court trying to put someone in jail for that. But I mean, if everyone's just bringing their weed in and everyone in the audience is smoking and there's a free-for-all, that's a problem. So with ideas like this, the more controlled you can get it, the more you can confine someone's weed to them.
No fun
their personal use. Yeah. So the more steps you take to ensure that my weed is my weed and your weed is your weed, and we're in a private place and no children, blah, 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 then the more illegal it starts to look. But the more of a free-for-all it becomes, then you should be worried. Yeah.
Sorry, excuse my stupidity now. I don't know if I'm asking the same question again, but hypothetically, you making a cheese ball and you crust it with this hemp seed that you can buy from Discount, and you do a catered adventure, for example, and there's a tray of cheese balls coated in this hemp crust.
Sounds delightful. But what's the question?
Is it Latin? Okay. Because you're selling it to a person who's going to pay you for that food.
And you can advertise it as such as well, obviously. You wouldn't just apply it.
Once again, that falls, if it's processed hemp,
it's processed,
not containing full seeds.
Well, this is not whole seeds, because they also sell like crushed seed, it can be ground into a flour, it can become a processed product.
Was it lawfully obtained?
Yes.
I mean, you've said it's come through Discount, but I think a large portion of it would be whether it was lawfully obtained.
Well,
because you can't make any sort of profits of unlawful activity, and that's not even a principle that's speaking about cannabis now, that's just general.
Yeah, it was an ordinary commercial Pt2 limited that we procured it through.
Yeah. Look, I mean, there's a question mark as to whether this whole, I mean, health stores have been selling the cannabis seeds for, what, decades now. Whether, strictly speaking in terms of the law, they were entitled to do that, or whether they always just did, and it was so absurd to hit them under those laws that it never happened. Well, we haven't found anything other than that which deals with hemp seeds and the fact that you've got the whole plant or any part thereof. I think what honestly happened with that was that people recognized that it was non-psychoactive, and there was this whole, what did you call it, what was the term of sterilizing them, or?
Termination.
Termination, yeah. They're supposed to be terminated. And I think people just gave up trying to stop that sort of thing because it was so absurd. And that speaks to the fact that there probably is no drive to prosecute you for anything like that. But whether it's strictly speaking legal under the law, probably not.
And also, some of the CBD oils, the extraction process, they use like alcohol and stuff like that. So, I mean, some of it can be harmful to people.
Hence why if you sell it, it has to be medical, and there are all those controls in place.
I mean,
but these guys are selling stuff that's not.
So what you
all the
actually
health
find,
shops.
a lot of the health shops and the CBD you're finding there, if you look carefully, it's actually just processed hemp oil. Not all of it's actually CBD.
CBD, they just say CBD, but it says hemp.
Yeah,
and the CBD that is being sold is not being legally sold at the moment. I mean, that's the long and the short of it, is that it's not lawful to have a pop-up shop and sell CBD products in the manner that it's being done at the moment.
Or to even advertise it.
Sure.
Yeah.
There was that recent thing with the Durban Poison beer that's been bought out by a big company.
Yeah.
And they were having issues about the fact that they named their product after, like we have rooibos in South Africa.
Yeah.
Can you give us a bit more?
So yeah, the proprietary, that's, you're talking about intellectual property law there. Unfortunately, Caitlin's not here to speak on that, but
Look, I'd be lying if I said I even knew the facts of that issue, of what you're referring to.
You know, somebody might have a proprietary right to the name Durban Poison, but whether they could register that right specifically in relation to cannabis is questionable. Yeah. So.
Yeah. Wasn't it related to like a genus of a plant name? You can't name something after something that's...
But the point is that's not a scientific name. Durban Poison is something that people have just called it for a number of years. But what I can tell you is that from an intellectual property perspective, you do struggle to register terms where the origin of it factors into the name. So you know you can't all of a sudden claim to own the rights to anything from Durban. It just doesn't work. So that might have been a bit. I suppose we need to actually study what
the thing would go all the strains. Swazi Gold, Malawi Gold, Durban Poison, Afghan Kush, all of that. You couldn't essentially name anything after that.
Well, quite the opposite is what you're saying. I think you wouldn't be able to protect those rights just yet. You wouldn't be able to own the right to the name Malawi Gold or Swazi Gold. Firstly, because you can't say that now everything that has the word Swazi or Malawi or Durban is, you know, you're infringing my trademark now. So I don't think it's a protectable intellectual property.
And just to get even nerdier, the fact that you call it gold is a demarcation of quality, which is also you know, you couldn't call it like Durban's best, for example. So Malawi Gold, there's an association of quality.
False advertising.
So it could be that the whole name is not registrable.
It's actually very rare that the components of a name for weed are like unique. I mean, there'll be some kind of region and they'll be named after a person or sour diesel. What am I going to
Well, in the States, the company Gorilla Glue sued the guys naming their strain Gorilla Glue because they have a glue company.
Gorilla Glue, yeah.
And they sold
America's a different place to litigate in.
Sorry, I know we might have touched on this earlier, but we know it's still illegal for a financial transaction to happen between money and marijuana. But two things I'd like to find out. If someone is unable to grow their own for their personal use and they have a friend do it for free, so there's no financial transactions, is that allowed? And secondly, are you allowed to trade marijuana strains? So if I'm growing a specific strand for myself for personal use and you are growing a specific strand and I'd like to try that, we do a trade exchange. So there's no financial gain anywhere. It's just this one might have higher CBD, as mine has high THC, whatever the case may be. Is that legal?
This guides you a little bit. Talks about it's inconsistent with the right to privacy, and then it says in constitutionally invalid to the extent. So this is the dealing provision. Prohibit the cultivation of cannabis by an adult in private for his or her personal consumption in private. So that's quite. And then you actually go to the definition of deal in. And it talks about cultivation, etc. I think, but this is, you know, it talks about supply, and supply doesn't say.
Well, trade, I would think.
It doesn't say for money, yeah, but you see again, it comes down to semantics. What was meant here? But I speak about there being contradictions in the judgment. You know, it says personal consumption by that individual in private, but then they say the private spaces might be outside of your own home, so that contemplates that you might be going to somebody else's private space so long as they're consenting. I don't see that the intentions of the Constitutional Court judges were to prevent people from sharing.
Sure.
Also because that means that only people who were possessed of cannabis plants prior to the judgment could then enforce the right to grow cannabis. Otherwise, how else do you get the seeds if not through sharing? Barter, though, is a form of exchange. So it doesn't need to be, you know, randellas that change hands in order for it to be. It doesn't help. Yeah.
That said, I think it'd be a tough day in court for a prosecutor who's trying to arrest you for freely giving seeds to someone. It's the only way that, as I said,
if I can give you an analogy. If you go to the bottle store and you go home and you throw a dinner party and you give all of your friends the wine that you bought, you don't need a liquor license for that. You are sharing your and you know it says here. Sorry, let's go back to this. his or her personal consumption. You see, there they use the word consumption, but other parts of the judgment use the word use. Now, use could be to grow a hedge. Use could be to entertain your friends. You see what I'm saying when I say that it's very hard to pick through the judgment and to give you very clear answers, because it says one thing here, it says something there, and then you sort of rely on which suits you better, but the contrary might suit the prosecutor better.
If you sell a product that's made of cannabis, is that legal?
What kind of a product? So just some clarity there.
A cookie, a brownie.
Yeah, it's illegal.
That's the same as selling a bud, insofar as the law is concerned.
So you make the butter.
See, I'm using cannabis. I make the butter.
Yes.
So I've got now something else to do with the butter.
Yeah.
So can I not share it with someone?
So you're asking if you can share it or sell it?
Yeah, are you looking to make a business, or are you
No,
hosting a
no.
dinner
If
party?
I'm having a party and I've got a whole lot of cannabis, I can't get into trouble if I've got cookies, I've got liquor, I've got all these things with cannabis.
I think the scale is going to be quite important there. So I think I misunderstood your question at the beginning. I thought you were asking, can I start selling cookies and brownies? Can I start making a business out of it? The answer for that is quite clearly no. But if you've got a dessert at home that's been prepared in a room full of consenting adults, I don't see the issue there. Consenting adults.
Not surprised they'd be like, well.
There's serious criminal ramifications for, for putting something in sneakily.
Sorry, so literally you basically go tell everybody it's going to be dope at your party. Somebody's going to run
the party's going to be dope.
Well, they don't have to smoke.
Just
smokers to consent. I mean, they can let you do it.
If you look at this paragraph, I mean, this has those contradictions within the same paragraph. You see, it talks about for personal use or personal consumption, but of course, use is far wider a concept than consumption. So which do you prefer, and which did the judges mean? I mean, short of a test case, we don't actually know exactly what the judges meant, unless they wrote it, which they didn't.
Yeah. So all these nuances and stuff, we'll have clarity on them once there are test cases. We need some brave individuals to go forth and try their luck.
Although we discourage it, actively discourage it.
Actively discourage it.
That's for the live feed.
Eventually, eventually we're gonna. That's how the law is going to be refined and understood better. What else?
Yeah, so I mean, you're free to stay for a drink afterwards. Thank you for coming, and we can have any other discussions.
And thank you for coming.
politicians talk about 6% or something like that of the total population. Those numbers are so when it comes to answers, when it comes to the population, if one makes the assumption we're about 50 million or like 60 million,
Like they say,
looking at out of the 15 people, cannabis smokers, is that a fair estimate? Yeah, so we're talking about between 8 and 12 million. But now we're talking also exactly. Yeah, and it's only going to exponentially grow. So, in terms of business potential, that's what I'm thinking. In terms of fighting each other again, business, that's what I'm connected with the political.